All right, summer classes for 2019. Here we are with Chapter 8, Political Participation in Voting. And with this chapter, we're past the halfway point of the 15 chapters that we'll be covering throughout this semester. Very interesting chapter dealing with what causes some people to participate, how they participate. Are there some groups of people in the United States that are more likely to participate than others? And so we can get a sense there of why some groups have more power and more influence through the use of the political system. And can that be a political system that can work for all groups and all people in some ways? So again, this issue of power, influence, being able to change the system, being able to get that system to work for the way you would want it to work. And this is from the very beginning of your chapter on page 284. And we can see here, my guess is almost all of you taking this class, you're in this category, and you're in the group of people that in terms of the numbers could influence and shape the outcome of elections and the political system more than any other group of people. So if you're thinking, which I understand when it comes to perhaps having more established authority in society, having more income, you would be led to believe that the baby boomers or people even older than the baby boomers have more power. But when it comes to the numbers, as you'll see here from this quote, and read through that section, those under the age of 35 actually have more overall power because of their overall voting numbers that could work in their favor. So we may think then that every person who votes is equal. It's a way of looking at political equality, one person, one vote. But can there be a situation in which people voting in some states actually have more power than other states or more influence? And clearly one of the ways of looking at that through the Electoral College is that, of course, some states are going to be more influential because they have more electoral votes. But another way of looking at that is, are there some states that are more competitive than others? And those are states referred to as the battleground states. Now, if you notice here, Politico, which is one of the sources I recommend for your news reviews, you have here a good portion of the states, over 60% of the states, have voted the same way in the last 5 presidential elections. Now, that was before 2016, so that may have changed in some of those elections, but it does tell us that a lot of the states are not really changing. But notice these battleground states are states that are not in that category, that can be or have been won by candidates of the 2 major parties in the recent presidential elections. Now, what caused this election to be, the last presidential election to be unique compared to most presidential elections where you had someone win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote? That's only happened 4 times in our history. And what you see here is a case of having the some of the states that were. So these are states that have been competitive. A lot of polling going back to Chapter 6 had predicted that you would have Clinton winning these states in red rather than Trump, or at least most of them. Perhaps Iowa and Ohio were suggested to go for Trump, but Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, most of the polling had a slight 2-3% advantage going for Clinton. And so the battleground states become, and there'll be this case in 2020, the key area for the campaigns. So it does tell us that where you are a voter, you're going to get more attention, your issues are going to become more important, to the candidates. So, and this is where the two parties are going to emphasize most of their money and volunteers will be in these battleground states. So it's not as if everyone's vote is equally as important. And so those are, again, the states that were the key for that election. And that's how you can have that unique situation where you can have a candidate in the Electoral College, where you can have a candidate lose the popular vote and still be elected president, as was the case for President Trump, candidate Trump, when he was running for election in 2016. So that's how you see the breakdown in the 2016 Electoral College. And again, we'll go into more detail about the Electoral College, but it's a winner-take-all system in almost all states. The person with the most votes and the popular vote within the state will have that person's set of electors to cast ballots. And so that's how you, again, can have that distortion. A couple of things to consider. Maybe some of you have voted. I would imagine some of you have. You have differences in some parts of the country over others, just logistically when it comes to casting a ballot. Perhaps this can be alleviated if you started to have mail-in ballots or other systems to be used when it comes to casting ballots. But if you have to stand in line to go vote and you have very few polling stations and a great number of people in those stations, you may have to wait a while to go cast your ballot. And overall, we see some of the differences here when it comes to voting. There's some discrepancies on who has to go and wait a little bit longer to go cast a ballot overall per average. I must say, in all the times that I voted here in Miami, Oklahoma, I don't think I've had to wait more than a couple of minutes ever. But we do see some differences there. Perhaps that can be alleviated, alleviated, if I can pronounce that right, by early voting, as we can see there on page 327. You can read about that. When it comes to voting, as you can see here on page 301, you're looking at the voting turnout and who is eligible to go vote. There are situations in which most people would be eligible to vote. There are a few reasons why people would not be able to meet that eligibility standard. And when it comes to voting, here you can see some of the differences that may turn out based on enthusiasm to go vote. So here you have a situation here, this is just an example of it. In an 8-year period, you can see a difference in a caucus, which we'll go into more detail when we get into Chapter 9. This is where people have to meet at a set time to go cast a ballot. And they have to publicly announce which candidate they will support. So it's generally not as, well, it's obviously not as open as the primary system or the general election in terms of providing opportunities to cast a ballot. But as we can see here, in 2016, there were not as many people showing up to vote as there were in 2008. And now one of the things that perhaps could increase the voter turnout could be having same-day registration, also referred to as election day registration. And that would not certainly help the caucus system, although I guess you could have people register to participate in the caucus on the same day. But we do see some differences there when it comes to turnout, and the turnout can have an influence on deciding which candidate will win the election. So here we can see some of the recent elections and some of the differences there. You did have a higher turnout overall for Black Americans over white Americans in the 2012 election. I do want to stress that that is just the turnout rate. It's not the overall percentage of voters. but you did see some differences there. Women have turned out more to vote than men in recent elections. And we do see demographics changing in America. This goes back to chapter 1 in our text, where we can see some differences that are happening there in our country. And we can just see that the population is changing. And as a result of that, we may see some differences here in the impact of our elections. And we're looking at one more election in which, as far as William Frey is concerned, someone who studies populations, this will be a key to determining who's victorious in elections. Now, most of our emphasis on voting turnout deals with presidential elections, but the midterm elections can be certainly just as important. It's determining who will be governor, who will be senator, depending on the state and what is up for election, what offices are up for election on midterm elections. As we can see here in Oklahoma, we've not had a real great turnout, but overall the turnout is not that fantastic for most midterm elections. And that is what made 2018 midterm election a very unique one. And perhaps this is the start of a new trend when it comes to voter turnout, but there was a 49% turnout in the midterm election. And that was the highest in 52 years, as we can see there. But Oklahoma has one of the lower voter turnouts than what we see in many of the states. And this is a lot of numbers coming at you here, and you don't really need to remember that too much except for this one area. And that is that consistently those over the age of 65 vote in all elections. So they're voting in the presidential election, they're voting in the midterm election. What we have not seen in the past, and again, 2018 may be different, that we have not seen a consistent maintaining of the voter turnout in the midterm elections compared to the presidential elections for younger Americans. And again, in 2018, if you notice here from page 312 in your text, the youth vote increased by 10% from the previous midterm election. And so that gives some indication that perhaps younger Americans are consistently voting now compared to what has been the situation in the past, where there would be a high turnout among young Americans in presidential elections and then would not vote in the midterm elections, where the older Americans not necessarily really increasing their voter turnout, just voting at roughly the same rates, but voting in the presidential election and the midterm elections in the same rates. And that's why then in the midterm elections, older Americans would have so much more influence. There are other forms of participation. The most frequent, though, again, is voting. You will see this on page 300 in your text. Excellent bar graph showing the different rates in which people participate in the different areas of how they will be active in different areas of participation. So even things like putting up signs. Some interesting questions about putting up signs, I would think, right? You know, some of you, I'm sure, do this. I would imagine most of you don't. But we see signs during a campaign, and does it have any impact? Does it really change anyone's mind? Is anyone really going to shift how they're going to vote based on a yard sign? I really question that. But I would also think that if you're a supporter of a candidate and you don't see any of that candidate's yard signs up, you're probably then wondering what's happened to your candidate. So at least it's a way of saying your candidate is competitive. And not having the yard signs may give some indication, may give some concern to the supporters of that candidate. Putting up yard signs. Volunteering, maybe that's part of what you do with as a volunteer. You put up yard signs. But we can see here, I was really interested in that in your chart there on page 300, that roughly 1 out of every 6 Americans has done this at some time. They have volunteered for a campaign, maybe passed out literature at a parade, gone door to door, made phone calls, those kinds of issues, those kind of activities to volunteer in a campaign. Have any of you done this? Gone to a community meeting, gone to a school board meeting, gone to a political party meeting, gone to a Friends of the Library meeting, perhaps? And if you haven't done that, this is just a reminder. If you don't go and you think that you have something more important to do, which you may very well have, or maybe you just want to binge watch something on television, and that's perfectly fine, but do keep in mind that somebody else is choosing that their time, this will be what they will do. This is the most important issue for them. And so if you're not at that school board meeting, just consider who would be there and who now will have the time and the information that they want to pass on to the members of the school board. They will have that opportunity to share their viewpoints where you would not. And if you're fine with that, that's okay. But you can't have influence if you're not there. And so there's where we can see the importance of attending these meetings. It's not a real high amount of people who've contributed to campaigns, but it's still pretty interesting that roughly 1 out of every 4 have said they've contributed to a campaign. Now, 79% said they voted in the general election, and we know that that's based on the numbers, just it's not happened. But perhaps people maybe have inflated contributing to a campaign as well. If that's the case, you would think maybe the numbers would be even higher than that. So if that's accurate, that's somewhat impressive that 1 out of every 4 people have found some way to give some money to a campaign. Now, when it comes to turnouts and voting, we certainly see many, and you'll see this on page 305 in your text, there are many countries that have a higher voter turnout than the United States. But it is worth noting that in some of those countries, it's compulsory. You're required to vote or you'll pay a fine. You'll be some sort of recognition, punishment. Not severe punishment, but paying a fine for not going or for not voting. And so we can see that even in that case, you still had roughly 24% of the population in Brazil that decided not to vote, even though it was compulsory. So I think what's impressive there is that in Germany, you have close to 70% of the people turning out to vote, and yet it's not compulsory. Now, so why is there a low voter turnout in the United States? And note that most of this is not really found in your text, so do keep that in mind. Well, one of the things is we don't have a voter holiday. That's been suggested recently, that we should have that day off, just like it would be a vacation or a national holiday, such as Christmas. And so almost all activities would be closed on that day and you can go vote. Would people take advantage of it? I would think there would be some people that would. Is it worthwhile to do that? It's always a very fair question. Do people have some time to go vote now? There's no doubt that depending on where someone's voting station is located, polling station is located, and how their work schedule is organized, there certainly are people where voting on the election day on Tuesday, and by the way, Tuesday is the day simply because really back in the 1700s, that was the day that farmers would bring their livestock and their crops to market on a Tuesday. So therefore, that's when you'd have an election. That's a couple of centuries back, and we know that agriculture doesn't operate that way today. So it's strange to still have the elections on a Tuesday. But with all that said, would it make that much of a difference in the voter turnout? But there are plenty of countries where there is, in fact, a voter holiday on the national election day. We really have only two political parties that matter. We'll go into more detail about that in Chapter 9. We can see here that that may mean that people are not that interested in either one of the political parties, may be less likely to go vote. This does come from an observation by a French political scientist named Maurice Duverger. It's been referred to as Duverger's law, that if you have a single district, simple plurality system, it will create only two major competitive parties. And in the Anglo system, which we're part of, really offshoot of the system from England, we have only two political parties. And we have that voting system, first past the post, single district, simple plurality system. Now, with that said, in United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all four of those countries have more than two competitive political parties. So to add to that, perhaps it's the Electoral College that creates this two-party system. Now, that's not part of the Constitution, and we certainly could have more than two competitive political parties, and most democracies do. It does seem that many Americans are quite comfortable with the two-party system, but it can also mean that people who are not attracted to either one of those parties are going to be less likely to vote. The campaigns go on for a very long time. The Iowa caucus has now been moved to early February, but still you go from early February at the first official vote in the nomination system for the presidency into the presidential election in November, then you're really pretty much covering a whole year. As we can see here in United Kingdom, the campaigns only last up to 2 months, so considerably shorter. So is there a fatigue among the voters when it comes to this the consistent campaign message and competition that's going on? May explain the low voter turnout. We have a lot of elections, and again, back to the question of fatigue. Maybe it's just overwhelming. There's just way too many elections to try to follow. And just consider wherever you're from, your county, your city, your school board, and then you have state questions, you have state offices, and then the federal offices. And then, of course, if you're a member of a tribe, you have tribal elections too. So there's just all kinds of elections that are going on, and with so much of that, as important as democracy is it a case where you have democracy overload and there's just way too much to follow? When it comes to political parties in the United States, do you have a political party that represents a particular class of people, the working class Americans? Now, class is a subject that we just don't really talk about in the United States. We don't really necessarily come out and say that there is a class system. I think there's perhaps many of you in this class that would buy into the idea that we do have one. But if we do, we don't really have a political party that then is for that one class of people. And many countries in Europe would have a political party geared towards the working class. The Socialist Party in France, you see their symbol in the center of this chart here. The Labour Party has traditionally been that type of political party in the United Kingdom. You can see it over here on your right. And then the Social Democrats in Germany over on your left. So the Democratic Party in the United States has somewhat been that way, but not consistently. And so you don't really have a clear-cut example of a political party working for the working class. So those are all explanations on why we have a low voter turnout. If voting is not a form of a type of activity that creates satisfaction for groups of people, then what alternative would there be? And so a activity outside the formal system is available for people, and that's protest. And there's some risk involved with protest. The government may not really allow it. And there can be some pushback to protest. You can read about this on page 297 in your text. But protests can also be effective. So here we go back to this question on page 311. You'll see some details about this. Who is more likely to vote? We can see that you do have a higher turnout. This may be changing, but we have seen a higher turnout among older Americans, among people with a greater amount of education. We see some differences among ethnicities. We see some differences here based on gender, not so much voter turnout, although we have seen in recent elections women are more likely to turn out to vote than men. But here on the gender gap, you have this issue of which political party are people of one gender more likely to support than the other. And so read about that, 316, 317. And we see that as well when it comes to religion and who's most likely to support what political party. This doesn't mean everyone of one particular religious background is going to have the same political connections and ideas, but there's some consistent patterns here. And here we're looking at the issue of the right to vote. And some of the changes that have occurred in our political system and in our Constitution as a result of amendments that have expanded that right to vote. Okay, we are going to now, in our next recorded lecture, we'll be looking at Chapter 9, Political Parties. Oh, sorry, one more point to mention here before we shut this down. And this is on page 327, some of the major changes to increase voter turnout. If that is the goal of a state and a political system, to expand the right to vote, to get more people to participate, there are certainly ways in which that can be done structurally to increase voter turnout. So change the registrations, allow people to vote from home, mail in a ballot, allow people to vote on other days than the election day. All right, we'll be moving on to Chapter 9, Political Parties.